My name is Christopher Buell. What happened when you could have called me a spoiled rich kid. I guess I have no defense for that. It was the early 90s, and I was 29, puttering around Spain, ferrying tourists around the Balearic Islands and the long stretches between Ibiza, Valencia, Barcelona. It wasn't even my boat. It was my father's. I was adrift. My gambling thing really took hold around 88. And then Hurricane Diana scared a lot of tourists away from the area in 1990. And suddenly I had to entertain the notion of carrying other things from place to place on the sea. I only did it 3 times, and I hated myself for it. But I had let my world become completely about the scramble for money. The last time I took contraband was May 1992, and that is what I'm remembering now. The job began the same way the last one had, with a casino acquaintance sending me a message asking if I wanted to deliver some milk chocolate on my next run out toward Alicante. That was the phrase Padre liked to use, milk chocolate. He thought that was real funny. I never asked what I'd be carrying specifically, never wanted to know, except I made it clear I wouldn't have anything to do with drugs or guns, just property. I went through the usual couple of hours of trying to talk myself out of agreeing, but then of course I did. This run, though, felt off from the start. The package that was brought on board in Santa Ponsa wasn't some easily concealable thing. I had to help 2 guys lug a huge 200-pound crate down into the hold and somehow clear space for it. If I got searched, there was no way to truly conceal this thing. But these guys paid half in advance, which was apparently rare, so I was already committed. I didn't have to do anything but ride the crate to Cartagena and transfer it to a bigger yacht. Just like the 2 jobs before this one, it could not have been easier. I even had 4 full days to get to where I was going because they didn't seem to quite grasp yacht speeds. Plus, the crate guys had nothing sinister about them. One of them was a nerdy-looking, preppy businessman type. The other was a very polite, middle-aged French guy, a lot of muscles, but perfectly pleasant. We talked about soccer. It went unspoken, of course, that me ratting them out or even deviating from the agreement would be met with violence. That crate made me nervous. And then, just before the first leg of the trip to Cala de Bou, I got a bit of a scare. I'd spent the afternoon at my preferred tiki bar, trying to wait out a rare rain squall while worrying about my taxes, and I finally just ran down the pier back to the boat, getting soaked. On board, I found that someone named Eusebio Trigo from the Civil Guard of Palma had been trying to contact me by radio. I had only brushed against its maritime service through their enforcement of the waters. I instantly felt a wave of heat roll through my stomach. Calm down, I thought. If you were suspected of something, they just come. I got this mental image of flashlight beams crisscrossing each other in the night as the law came down the pier to wake me and search the boat. But when I calmed myself and called back, Trigo told me that the Palma authorities simply wanted to offer me a contract job, having picked me kind of out of a hat based on the size of my boat, my proximity, and the services I offered in my crappy ads. My sense of relief was very slow in coming. This foul, nervous energy kept tingling in my spine. There had been a wreck in the Sangüesas Islands the week before. I'd heard about it in passing. An old converted tugboat had gone down, with the skipper being the lone fatality. Trigo told me that the 7 survivors, who were all missionaries, had been choppered to the hospital in Palma for observation and rest for a week while arrangements were made to get them back to their tiny outpost. But because these people had spent everything on transport for their 6-month relief mission to Algiers, they didn't have a dime, so it was going to be right back on a boat for them. A charitable act on Palma's part, delivering them. Did I, Trigo was asking, want to pick them up in Puerto de Palma and carry them back to the Sangüesas for pay? I asked how much. The rough figure he quoted would barely be enough to pay for the passengers' food, plus turn such a small profit I wouldn't have normally considered it. not as much as I owed back then. But it occurred to me that if I accepted the offer, it might be like buying a get-out-of-a-search-free card, might deflect just a tiny bit more suspicion that could arise out there on the ocean. Ferrying wreck survivors was a lot less search risky than traveling alone. The route was kind of on my way to the drop if I could build just another 12 or 14 hours into it. I asked if it was possible to pick the people up the next afternoon instead of night. It was critical that I deliver them long before I transferred the crate, so no one would ever know others had been on board with it. Trigo said he'd do what he could. I could sign the papers at the dock in Puerto de Palma. I did ask, casually, what had caused the wreck that sent those people into the water and the vessel to the bottom. I wasn't familiar at all with the rivers that cut through the remote Sangüesas. Trigo told me that the boat had been hopelessly unseaworthy, and there were no nautical safety issues I needed to worry about. That was how I wound up carrying not just contraband, but also traumatized missionaries toward a place I'd never been before. They boarded the boat off a pier beside an abandoned yacht basin just as the sun began to set. It wasn't until that moment that I found out none of them spoke a word of English or even Spanish, and I had no translator. For regulatory reasons, I had to have a mate on board at the start of the trip, but I thought I might ditch my handyman Jensen in Ibiza because I didn't want him with me in the unlikely case of the boat being searched. He spoke English, Spanish, and Catalan, but not Basque. It was going to be an awkward ride to the islands. The missionaries, they weren't quite what I expected. When that word was first mentioned, I'd pictured, young do-gooders in shorts and sweats with I Heart Jesus on the front. But they were all at least in their 60s, all men, and they wore a very specific sort of garb given to them in the hospital since their clothes had been either lost or were beyond hope. In a weird way, it made them all monk-like, in these loose-fitting plain black tops and black string-drawn pants with dark slip-on sneakers that didn't always match. Cult-like might be a better word. I didn't even know really what religion they adhered to. They nodded at me deferentially as they came aboard, but there were no smiles. That was understandable. They'd experienced a shipwreck, and someone had died in it. These men knew the terror of being cast into the sea. One of them had a cast on his left arm. Another's right eye had been badly damaged and bruised. I don't think he could see out of it. Their only belongings now were these kits they'd been given with toiletries, some snacks. Everything else they'd had was gone. Off we went. The Star Hunter could hold 12 passengers, so they settled into shared cabins, and they sat with each other on the little sofas in the parlor area a lot, speaking quietly in Basque. The food I'd arranged to have brought on was easy enough to prepare, and Jensen basically mimed for them how to do it while I navigated up at the flybridge. I'd camouflaged the crate in the hold as best I could. If Jensen ever did get a good look at it, he never mentioned it. He was a friendly guy, a burly, ponytailed surfer type who, at 23, loved two things above all else: to sail and to chase very tall women, but to the detriment of his professional future, not in that order. We fell behind a little right away because of some unexpected military maneuvers in the shipping lanes off the west coast. We had to detour around them. That cost us a couple of hours. I was doing a lot of thinking as I steered us. I started to feel like maybe I wanted Jensen to stay on so we could move faster, and I could also avoid the fine that might come if it was discovered I was carrying passengers with no mate. The missionaries went to bed early, and our route was easy and steady all night. Just before dawn, Jensen came up on the flybridge and took the wheel, and I headed down to my cabin for a few hours of sleep. I saw one of the missionaries on deck, sitting in a folding chair, just looking out at the water. I nodded at him as I passed. He barely seemed to notice me. His gaze was very intense. I wondered what he must be thinking about. The sea was very calm, but that can bring its own unsettling atmosphere depending on how you perceive silence like that and where you are in life. The meaningless repetition of the patterns of the waves, hour after hour, can make the sea seem cold and indifferent, sterile, even secretive. At night, you get very aware of the moon and the clouds and how far away from all things you really are. It maybe feels like drifting through outer space might feel. The old man had his eyes locked on the horizon line. I came awake around 9 because Jensen was shaking me awake, wanted me to come up and check out a radio transmission, get my opinion on it. He didn't think it could wait. It had been transcribed to the printer up at the helm, and downing a warm Pepsi, I read it as we kept cruising, the sea still completely open and unspoiled before us. It was from the Civil Guard. The Maritime Division routinely sent out informational calls about anything that affected route traffic, plus the usual weather warnings, regulatory reminders, etc., etc. And once in a great while, there was a bulletin like this one. It had been about a year since I'd seen one last, and I'd only been in an area where it affected me twice. There was a piracy alert stretching from the Bay of Palma to the Urus Archipelago. A reefer ship had repelled an attack from what was probably a Tunisian vessel. There had been talk recently about heightened piracy around the Balearic Islands. Armed bandits had taken down a container ship full of microchips fairly recently. I swore under my breath, and Jensen asked me if we should alter our course. That would mean entering the Sangueses Islands from the east instead of the north, and slogging down the skinny Navascuas River to the missionaries' village, really reducing our speed. On the other hand, keeping steady took us pretty much right through the worry zone the bulletin described for a good 6 hours. Our chances of actually getting targeted were only 1 in 500, I guessed. A yacht like the Star Hunter is easy pickings, but the ocean's a big place. I worried, though, about what I had on board, and what it could mean if it were discovered by the kind of people whose motivations I could not predict. I studied the charts more carefully. The Navascuas was supposedly reliable and calm enough, but fairly shallow in places, with occasional rock outcroppings rising above the surface of the water, sometimes 20 feet above it. Not ideal, but there were only so many routes through the Sangueses. It was a political territory problem. Vessels like mine had to keep fairly close to the ascribed waypoints. That way just seemed like the solution we'd have to settle on. Jensen grokked the plan, so we began to reroute right away. When he read back to me the bearing he was supposed to follow, I went back down to get just a couple more hours of sleep. I moved past the cabins where the men slept and slid a thin door open to descend into the cramped hold. My curiosity had been gnawing at me for hours. I pulled away the blankets and tarp covering the crate. It couldn't be opened without a crowbar and a drill. After some hesitation, I went about opening it anyway. I would be extremely careful not to leave any traces behind. My drill work was very clean and might not have even woken anyone up above. I had the top of the crate loose inside of 10 minutes. There was only a single enormous object inside that crate, packed with silvery, expanding foam. I could only get a glimpse of the top 12 inches of what lay within. But I knew enough about the sea and about its history to know that I was looking at a ship's bell. This one looked incredibly old, cracked. Normally, an antique ship's bell would go for maybe 3,000 or 4,000 on the open market, so heavy hitters wouldn't bother with such a thing. Hell, that would have barely paid me for taking it to Cartagena. This one, I thought, must have been more special. I didn't know then about the recent theft from the Fado Museum in Lisbon of the bell that had once adorned a ship helmed by the 18th century pirate Charlton Falk. In the last moments of his life, he'd actually been hung from the clapper by bandits. First, though, they'd hacked his feet off with a sword to mock his reputation as an athlete. Estimated monetary value of the bell? $450,000. I was uneasy all the next day. The same dodgy risk-taking that had gotten me into so much gambling trouble had claimed me again, and I knew it. I was now locked into a timetable and a plan that had far less room for error than it did 24 hours before. If I'd had another full day to make my decision to take the missionaries, and someone to talk some sense into me, I probably would have realized it was all too much of a roll of the dice. I think now that I tried to assign conscience-cleansing properties to the act of carrying those missionaries home. I wanted so hard to find some little act of redemption that I became even more blind to the dangers of taking that chance. It was gray and almost a little chilly that day all the way onto the Navasquez and along its banks. There was a reason tourists didn't make this area much of a stop. No one had ever colonized the Sangüesas to their potential. The government of Spain had wanted to turn half of the islands into a nature preserve, but that in itself would have been a massive investment of time and money. The population among the 5 islands combined was about 800. Once you were on the Navasquez, your only viable destination was out the other side of the islands back into the Balearic. Boat traffic was negligible. No money to be made, no pretty scenery to be seen, just a chain of starving fields and small hills choked by trees leading deeper into jungle, the shoreline broken up by craggy, barren escarpments. I'd heard the Sangüesas were sometimes used by drug traffickers to dump bodies. At its most narrow, the river was only 100 feet wide. We even had to deal with fog throughout the day. It got frustratingly thick sometimes. The missionaries kept to their cabins for the most part. But then when I was on a break, I noticed all 7 of them were sitting in the parlor at the long table there, not speaking. A few of them had clasped their hands with each other. 10 minutes later, Jensen came up to the flybridge, and I mentioned what I'd seen. He had tried to explain to them, with the 10 Basque words he knew, plus a napkin sketch featuring a stereotypical black pirate flag, why we were on this stretch of the river, as opposed to still moving west on the ocean. And they'd seemed to grasp and accept it well enough, but they'd gotten very quiet since then. I felt guilty about that. I'd probably underestimated the effect of having to see and feel any part of this river again so soon. I thought I might contact the Civil Guard to see if maybe I could get a translator on the air just for a few minutes. It felt like we needed to get some kind of real communication going. It was another thing I was feeling uneasy about. This river has a weird history, Jensen told me, and he explained the legend as he understood it. In the middle of the 18th century, Red Richard Chick had kidnapped the family of one of his rivals, Arthur Montcalm, and hidden them away for ransom in an old garrison, snatched a mother and her 4 grown daughters. But the ransom wasn't given up, not for 1 month, not for 6. For 2 years, Arthur Montcalm searched the Indian Ocean for his family while stubbornly refusing to pay it. Finally, dying of some intestinal sickness, yet still cruel enough to crave some Pyrrhic victory in that sick struggle against Montcalm's pride, Red Richard Chick had gone to the garrison one day where those 5 women had been held in ghastly conditions for so long, and he shot them all dead, then tossed their bodies into the Navasquez. When Montcalm finally located their skeletons almost 4 years after the abduction, he hung himself in his bedroom on his lonely estate. Historians debated whether some old stone ruins found about an hour up the river from us on the edge of the jungle were, in fact, the last vestiges of the garrison that had cut those women off from the world forever. It was one of the most unsavory pieces of pirate history I ever heard. In late afternoon, on May 25th, I got the urge to pick up the pace. We were just about 4 hours away from our destination. I was kind of curious to see the village where the missionaries lived, but I decided we wouldn't be docking there longer than the time it took to get them off the boat. I decided I hated the Navasquez, hated its tedious bends, and the way I always had to keep an eye out for the very rare giant rock outcroppings poking above the water. It was weird how every time we approached one, giving it a very wide berth, gulls would start to gather on it, swooping down in flocks. Then they would just watch the boat go by, hundreds of them, thousands of them, unmoving. And when we finally did pass, off they would go again. The bank became cluttered with trees, and finally, dense jungle. The missionaries ate quietly, and then all of them gathered on the skinny starboard deck to observe our passage through the area. They didn't say much to each other. One of them especially made me unsettled. I think maybe he was the youngest among them, a bald man with pale blue eyes who always looked at me with mistrust. He paced a lot, always seemed to be tense. With only about 2 hours to go from the end of their part of the journey, I saw the ruins. It was late dusk, and the battlements reaching just above the tree line were silhouetted against a ruddy orange strip of sky, stars beginning to appear in the dark blue above it. "Yeah, I think that might be the old garrison," Jensen said beside me, peering at the scene through binoculars. A hopeless, hollow crumble of moss-licked stone. It was surrounded by choking foliage, making access on foot pretty much impossible. We turned to see that blue-eyed missionary standing behind us on the flybridge. He was speaking to us now, firmly and directly, but we didn't understand a word. He was not asking us a question, and he wasn't issuing a command. He spoke 2 or 3 sentences, and without waiting for a reply, he turned and went down to rejoin his fellows. Jensen just looked at me, spreading his arms. We had no idea what to do for him. Night fell. Wanting to keep to the wheel rather than passing off that duty for a time to Jensen, who wasn't quite as experienced with a boat the size of the Star Hunter as I was, I took a couple of caffeine pills, expecting to push myself for many more hours. We had seen other boats sporadically, but there had come a point when it seemed we were alone on the river as we curved onto the Legusio tributary for the last stretch to the missionaries' village. The shoreline was virtually inaccessible, with no beach to speak of. The foliage grew all the way down to the waterline. The rock outcroppings became more numerous, and I was grateful I'd had the spotlight serviced recently to shine on the dark waters ahead. I slowed the boat further until we were just drifting along. According to the maps, we were in for about a half hour of slow going before I could really feel safe in opening up the engine again. I gave the wheel to Jensen at 10:30, just so I could go put a sandwich together and try to work up a smile for the missionaries who had left the starboard deck for a time but then returned. The civil guard hadn't gotten back to me about my casual request for a hookup to someone who might speak a little Basque. I wondered if a thumbs up was enough of a universal language to make our guests feel better. I moved past them, coming back up, sandwich in hand. 2 were standing at the railing, watching the bank. The one who seemed to be the oldest of them all was stretched out in a recliner, eyes closed, breathing softly. The bald, blue-eyed one was sitting in a chair and leaning forward like he usually did, hands folded beneath his chin. My friendly nod and smile and rather pathetic double thumbs up were answered not verbally but with one of the missionaries, the one with the bruised eye, rising and blocking my path just a little aggressively. As the others watched, seeming to expect this, he held a piece of paper out toward me. One of them had drawn a representation of the area with a thick black marker I kept in the galley to make point-to-point timing notes on a whiteboard. I had to squint to make the drawing out in the dark. There was the tributary and the river, and the part of the Sanguesas that would roughly correspond to our position if I were to refer to a more accurate map. Then there was a little boat shape, which I assumed represented the Star Hunter. A wide ring of small black X's surrounded it, suggesting we were in a dangerous patch or a place we should otherwise be avoiding. That was all the information the drawing gave me. Whether I was being warned about pirates or rocks or hidden sandbars or something else, I didn't know. I gave it some respectful, lingering study, and I pressed it to my chest along with my sandwich. I put my free hand out to the missionary's shoulder, and I nodded firmly, attempting to suggest I understood fully and I would be watching carefully. He didn't seem terribly impressed. I walked past and looked at them all in turn, offering up another weak smile. They looked at me like a jury would. The missionaries spread out as the yacht chugged on very slowly. A couple of them went to port side, while a couple took up positions on the aft deck, as if they wanted to set up a wide surveillance. I had their sketch on the helm panel as I steered us, and I would look down at those little X's from time to time. Nothing on my maps or my notes jibed with them, but I accepted the fact that the missionaries knew this place better than me, and I caved to caution. I wished I had known more about the circumstances of their wreck and precisely where it had happened, but I was sure it was back on the main river itself, not the Legusio tributary. I called into the Civil Guard one more time, and I asked to be patched through to Eusebio Trigo directly, not having much hope I would be. But unexpectedly, his voice piped through the speaker. I had him confirm that the tugboat wreck had happened on the river and not the tributary, and he said that yes, if I was on the Legusio going north, I was really nowhere near the wreck. I told him, trying not to sound aggravated, that the missionary seemed to be suggesting this path wasn't the safest I could have chosen. And Trigo advised me to remember that none of them were seamen, and it was probably superstition that was clouding their judgment. The missionaries' contact with the outside world was very limited. What are they superstitious about? I asked. But Trigo just ignored that and muttered some meaningless word of official appreciation for my taking the job, and we cut off contact. An ancient-looking fishing boat finally appeared on the water to port side, moving without lights in roughly the same direction. There seemed to be only one person on it, and he stood at the stern and watched us. Jensen waved at him through the dark, but there was no response. Old man, looked like. Didn't look like a commercial fishing boat. More likely he lived within the Sangueses. He turned the wheel and veered off sharply at a natural waypoint created by another rock outcropping. A single, cruel, organically tapered spike jutting up from the water. We kept going ahead, and the fisherman broke off for deeper waters, disappearing quickly as if getting too close to us had scared him. "Look there," Jensen said from behind me as I kept our course steady up at the helm. He manually maneuvered the spotlight, angling it toward the bank. The beam glinted off a horde of tiny eyes. Small creatures had emerged from the jungle and now crouched at the waterline, watching us pass. Lizards, dozens upon dozens of lizards of all sizes, some 3 feet long. They stepped on and over each other to settle into the grass and the sand, keeping low, almost like sentries standing guard, making sure that interlopers on the water kept on moving. We embarked on another long, slow curve. The pale glow vanished from each pair of eyes in linear succession as we moved, and finally they were all behind us. Jensen swung the spotlight beam back into position beyond the curve so I could see everything up ahead. Just as he did, there came a low flapping noise from 2 different directions. A cloud of gulls was passing overhead, but their din got louder because they were beginning to descend. Gulls landed on the boat on every available surface space. On the roof of the flybridge, the bow, the stern, even a pair of birds on the crest of the spotlight itself. I looked downward to see a couple of the missionaries on the starboard side draw back slowly from their watch positions as the birds lined up on the railings. It took them only about a minute to populate virtually the entire boat. It was the starboard side, the side closest to the shore, that they congregated to exclusively, though. leaving the port side empty. The birds faced the jungle. I heard raised voices below me. Two of the missionaries were arguing as they moved from port to starboard, with one trying to placate the other, who gestured angrily and pounded one fist into his open palm 2 times. Then they lapsed into silence again. Now all the missionaries, as well as the gulls, were starboard. Something was in the air around us that did not need verbal acknowledgement. Something unhealthy. I thought of a Geiger counter beginning to crackle eerily in the creeping presence of radiation. I flipped a few little-used switches on my control board and essentially cut out every light on the boat. Reducing every bit of ambient glow that way gave my night vision a chance to absorb more of the surroundings. I had Jensen cut the spotlight, too. He angrily shooed away the gulls that had perched on it. They fluttered down one level to merge with a line of their siblings on the stern. We glided past a giant, ominous rock on the starboard side. It was shaped like a lumpy fist. Just as we passed it, Jensen's hand shot out and grabbed me by the upper arm with startling aggression. I turned, eyes wide. Every gull on the Star Hunter took off at that moment, fluttering madly upwards into a loose V shape. The flock gathered and swooped off to the west, then over the fat part of the river and toward the horizon. They seemed to take all sound with them. The silence that veiled us as I saw what Jensen had seen near the shore seemed to muffle even the soft lapping of the sleepy waves against the hull of the boat. 2 pyramidal rock formations protruded from a spot near the shoreline where it was too shallow for a heavy boat to explore. There were human figures standing on the slim natural shelves, etched and worn into that rock over the millennia. 2 figures on one pyramid, 3 on the one 20 yards away from it. In the dark, we could still see that the people were facing us, arms at their sides. Not wanting to startle whoever was out there with the harsh spotlight just yet, I grabbed the long-throw flashlight beside the helm panel and switched it on to pick up 1 or 2 further details of this weird tableau. Each of them wore a similar kind of long dress. Their uniformly long hair lay damp on their shoulders, as if they had been swimming. They watched us as the lizards had, impassively. I got a glimpse of one of the women's hands, which I perceived to be unnaturally swollen, and then the actual face of the woman beside her. All my mind registered was cavernous eye sockets, and a single shock of that damp hair dividing them with geometric perfection. Then even the few yards the boat had drifted since this awful image appeared put us too far away for the flashlight to have any effect. Jensen and I watched the women step off their perches. First the shortest of the group of 5, then the other 4 in rapid sequence, as if following her lead. They plummeted into the water below them feet first, but where I expected to hear a splash, the sound that came across that space each time was more like that of pennies dropped into motor oil. Each time one of the women went in, the water was barely dispersed from her entry point. No white cap, no bubbling, just a digestion. And then they were simply gone. Every man on board stared dumbly at the water, waiting for someone to emerge. But no one did. We floated past. I heard a bird trill somewhere in the jungle. "I'm going down," Jensen whispered, but I went instead, telling him to stay and keep an eye on the rocks. I was halfway down the ladder that led to the main deck, the flashlight nestled in the crook of my arm, when there was a soft thumping against the boat's hull, then another one, then another. One of the missionaries began to shout, backing away from the starboard railing. What I saw next, I saw from my position frozen on the ladder, looking downwards from above, scared to descend even one rung further. 2 running shapes appeared from around opposite blind corners of the starboard deck. The missionaries closest to them never even had a chance to react to their startling approach. The shapes engulfed the men, wrapping long arms around them. In the dark, I saw the hems of dresses flare outwards, though they were heavy and damp. The men cried out. Wet hair slapped their necks and faces. One of the women clasped a bloated hand over a missionary's eyes, the one with the cast on his arm. And then those men were dragged toward the railing like hostages clawing for their freedom. In an impossible act of strength and balance, those women then flung themselves backwards over it, carrying their prisoners with them, who were heavier than they were. Legs and feet rattled the railing, and then they were all over the side. Even before the tremendous splashes were heard, real splashes this time, another pair of gray hands emerged and seized the railing from below. A head and torso thrust itself over it. The oldest missionary on the deck backed away, putting his arms out in self-defense, but the woman from the river clambered over the railing in a heartbeat, exhibiting terrifying strength in her upper body. Her bare feet landed with a slap on the surface of the deck. She regained her balance swiftly and took one great stride toward the man, seizing him angrily by the neck. Then, as two other missionaries leapt from the top of the railing, diving headfirst into the black water below to try to save their comrades, the last one left emitted a stifled gurgling sound, his breath cut off by his attacker's foul hands. The old man was yanked toward the railing. The woman dropped an arm to secure him by the waist, and then, like the others, she sprung upwards. Her weight settled fully on the railing for a split second before she toppled backwards, taking the helpless missionary with her. He had been trying his hardest to scream. I heard them hit the water, and only 10 seconds after those shapes had first appeared on the deck, there was no one left there but me. The only two missionaries who were not now in the river had escaped into the parlor area, from which they could run to the boat's lowest level. I jumped off the ladder and landed on a set of muddy footprints. Jensen was yelling something incoherent above me as he started to descend as well. I looked over the starboard railing into the quiet, lapping waves. There was not the slightest disturbance in them. I feebly shone the flashlight beam down there, but all that did was turn the water a sickly pale green as I swept the beam across random patches to detect signs of either life or death. But whatever lay beneath was not going to reveal itself. I turned, crossed the deck, and yanked open the door to the parlor. Jensen had caught up with me. He and I stood in the darkness where, just 3 weeks before, a group of hard-partying graduate students celebrating some academic milestone had tried to pull us into a game of strip poker. Now the bar, the 2 sofas, and 4 plush chairs were all vague humps. We listened, trying to detect some sound which would hint where the 2 missionaries had run to. Jensen was silhouetted beside me. All my decision-making capabilities were shot. I could only reason in the tiniest increments, moment to moment, sense to sense. I spun when I heard a whimpering sound from behind me, and I cued the flashlight again. The beam fell on a pair of spindly legs and thin, dark cloth. The man with the icy blue eyes had been sprawled on the sofa 5 feet away, afraid to make a sound when Jensen and I had entered. Now he forced himself to stand, muttering, hands held out in appeal. Gone was his previous cold demeanor. He looked at us pleadingly, blinking away the intrusive circle of light. We didn't know how to ask him where the other had gone, whichever one of them it was. I hadn't deduced yet that it was the man who had held the sketch out to me, the sketch showing an apparent danger zone on the river, represented by a circle of tiny black X's. None of it would matter. My attention and Jensen's were drawn past the bald man's face toward the open door at the back of the room, the one which led below decks to the passenger cabins and the galley. A column of orange light had emerged there, fanning out on the wall beside the narrow staircase. Jensen yelled, "Fire!" and broke toward the door. I motioned to the missionary to stay where he was, but he had shown no initiative to help anyway, seeming lost. He sank to his knees and spread his hands on the floor, head down. I believe he was praying silently. Jensen needed my help. I took 2 steps in the direction of the staircase. From below, Jensen's disembodied shout demanded that someone stop. Stop what they were doing! What had they done? It coincided with the appearance of a shadow in the parlor doorway. How long the woman had been standing there, watching us, I could not know. The spreading fire glow from the staircase painted her ever so slightly with a dull orange flicker. Her face appeared absolutely pummeled by time and gravity, imprisoning her beyond age. She might have been 16, might have been 60. Her eyes, which looked like they had tried to collapse into her skull and cower eternally from human light, held no intelligence greater than an insect's. Her dress was little more than a sack cut clumsily as a defense against the elements. She wore nothing on her pallid feet, whose toenails curled grotesquely in different directions. I heard her breathing, her mouth emitting the high-pitched flute tone of lungs whose passageways were all but sealed. The visible part of her throat bulged and relaxed. She was laboring to swallow again and again. It was the most biologically familiar indicator that she had at least once been like me. In that weirdly prolonged moment of inaction, it was almost like we were trying to comprehend each other's existence, this thing and the frightened humans it perceived. The moment ended when the bald missionary rushed towards her, holding no weapon. I swear it was only at the moment of violence that her hands grew, became the same sort of misshapen claws I had seen on the others. Until that instant, they had appeared almost normal, save for the neglected and elongated nails and the gray skin. But when she raised one arm and swatted the missionary brutally across the face, her right hand was almost as large as his head. She did more than hurt him. His neck cracked, and he stumbled beside her and collapsed, unconscious or dead. She immediately bent at the waist, seized his torso, lifted him, and began to drag him out of the room. His head, lolling helplessly against the woman's shoulders, connected hard with the door jamb as she hauled him away. The second she cleared the passage, the door slammed violently shut behind her on its own. Another act of physical impossibility. 2 heartbeats passed, and then, still frozen pathetically in place from terror, I heard a great splash. Smoke was starting to flow steadily from the stairwell. It's still hard for me to understand how that last panicking missionary caused such a great burning in so little time, and I'm left to believe he had been preparing for it even before we saw the women on the rocks, or at least envisioned how it would have to happen if we were attacked. The flares in the bow cabinet would have ignited things well, and he likely knew after 2 days on board where there was accessible propane. There was no way that man could know, of course, that the most flammable thing on board the boat was just down in the hold. The chemically treated expanding foam that surrounded the ship's bell when it did catch probably sparked a conflagration that all but guaranteed the boat would sink. I barely made it down the claustrophobic twisting staircase to the cabins when vision became impossible, and breathing virtually so. I yelled out for Jensen again and again, retreating upstairs only when the heat and the smoke became absolutely unbearable. I was now the captain of an empty vessel. The only faces I might see were those of women come to take me down into the deep, and some part of me would have welcomed it. But even in the sensory chaos that swallowed me, wicked bolts of logic shot through the primal centers of my brain. Men were lost in the river, men were lost on board. There would be an investigation that would rend my existence in pieces. The boat had to burn. The bell had to sink. my only way out of this nightmare was the immolation of everything around me. So I did not fight the fire, which would have won in the end anyway. I only did all I could to evade it as long as possible. It was the relentless coils of smoke that ultimately presented the most danger, as for the next 10 minutes I weaved all over the boat, climbing higher only when finally necessary. I was drenched in torrid golden light everywhere I went. At one point I ducked when a freak arrow of flame leapt toward me as I passed the doorway to the parlor one last time. Everything in there had begun to burn, and I don't know what specific small object it was, coated in flame, that shot off and nearly struck the side of my head. Whatever it was, it arced over the port railing and into the river. Yes, it was the port side I navigated in the last extremity, though the smoke was worse there. I was terrified to go starboard, where the women had come from. I draped my head with a towel and rushed through the billowing clouds that poured through the parlor windows. Superheated ash blew into my face, and I screamed, almost losing my balance. Then I was at the port-side ladder, my irritated eyes spewing defensive tears. Up I went. I had time to send out a distress call from the helm, but no time to receive a response. And then I took a deep breath and prepared to shimmy back down the ladder, this time directly into a swirling veil of smoke. My final gamble. The ladder descent lasted only 5 seconds. My hands were scalded on the metal. I could see almost nothing of the deck anymore. As soon as my feet touched it, I ran blindly forward and hurled myself over the side of the boat. Upon crashing through the surface of the river, I did a gentle, involuntary somersault within the absolute dank darkness that enfolded me. Where I was facing, whether I was upside down or right side up, I didn't know or care. I briefly felt the same peace and liberation from earthly bonds that morphine had once dangerously blessed me with long ago after surgery. But I popped up, gasping almost right away. The current began to pull me in the direction the boat had been headed, and I still had enough strength to successfully keep myself above the waterline. I watched the burning ruin of my livelihood seem to fold in on itself little by little, lighting up the night. I forced myself to watch, then forced myself to stop watching for good. I let myself float on my back, only occasionally trying to course correct when I sensed I was being pulled too far out from shore. Unless a chance rock outcropping emerged to give me a place to cling to, I had only a little time before I would have to begin the struggle to make it to land. In the end, I did look back once more, when there was not even the faintest fire glow around me, and I could no longer hear much of anything of the Star Hunter's final agonies. It appeared as a small, blotchy pulse of yellow light cast all the way to the trees on the shoreline. A grand funnel of murky smoke wended its way from the core of the boat up toward the stars. Someone was standing on the bow as the whole mass began to slowly descend into the river. A burning figure whose bodily structure was only faintly outlined. She was facing in my direction, watching me float away, arms at her sides as the fire consumed her, yet did nothing to weaken her poise. Her skeleton withstood and maybe even fed from the blaze. I escaped her stare by going under the water. In that forgiving, wet tomb, I was, ever so briefly, safe. By all rights, a cold hand should have come from below me to grab an ankle and pull me into eternity. But that never happened. I stayed under, engulfed by echoes for as long as I could, and emerging with a great, desperate gulp of the air, faced the west for the rest of the night's ordeal. The fisherman we'd seen not long before was the first one to reach the wreck, and his decades of experience navigating dark waters helped him spot me further down the river. I was cowering and shivering on a rock I hadn't even seen coming up in front of me. Striking it unexpectedly gave me a concussion, and I barely seemed to know where I was when the old man pulled me aboard his trawler. Before the maritime authorities reached the scene, to be followed by the eventual discovery and salvage of the stolen ship's bell, and my delivery to the wrath of justice, there were 10 quiet and peaceful minutes with that fisherman. He spoke a little English, and after laying 3 blankets gently on top of me, he said to me, "Did you see something there? Women, did you see?" Curled on my side on a bunk in the dark, I gave the only truthful answer about what happened I would give for 20 years. It has been 2 years now since I last dreamed of the Sangueses Islands. Strangely and thankfully, I have never seen the women in those dreams. They seem to be hiding from me. Instead, I hear Jensen shouting through the jungle at me as I pass by on the bow of the old fisherman's trawler in the dead of night. Lizards congregate, watchful, on the shore. Though I can't see Jensen, I know he's pulling plaintively on the bars of the garrison. But I will not let him out unless he tells me why I was left to live. I have always assumed the women knew the best way to torture a pirate is to make him wander the world, remembering the things he's done. Jensen, now a quarter of a century dead, never gives me a different answer.